Hello and welcome everyone, my name is Tsuki, and in this video we're going to talk about which jobs you might be interested in playing in Final Fantasy XIV. There are 15 jobs currently in Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood, and I will be going over each of them and providing a brief overview of each job. I'll try my best to point out any noticeable strengths and flaws of each job, and give a little insight into the job's mechanics. But remember that at the end of the day, that this is simply my own advice, and that on its own is really no substitute for unlocking and trying each job yourself, which, in case you are new to the game or unaware, you can unlock and play every single job, and even every single crafter and gatherer on a single character. So if something looks interesting, unlock it and give it a shot yourself. With that all of the way, let's get into the video. So for people new to the game or looking to get into it, I want to first go over the different roles that I'll be using to categorize and compare jobs. In case you think you already have this knowledge and want to skip this section, I'll be sure to place timestamps in the description and the comment section of the video. So let's get into it. Now the three main roles outlined by the game are tanks, healers, and DPS. DPS can further be broken down into three subcategories, those being melee, caster, and ranged. But let's talk about tanks first. Tanks are the designated leaders of the party. They will be the ones to initiate pulls and will set the pace of dungeons. In terms of rotations, tanks have a pretty simple and straightforward means of dealing damage, and that's because a lot of the difficulty for tanks comes in holding enmity, moving and positioning bosses for mechanics, and using their defensive cooldowns to properly mitigate damage. One major perk of being a tank, however, is that they are very high in demand. You'll find that as a tank, your queue times for content in the duty finder will be very short if not instant, and you'll find that party finder groups will almost always be looking for tank slots to fill. So you'll be very high in demand and you'll find little problems finding a party. Next are healers. Healers are the heart of the party, and a good healer can carry a party much further than any other role can. They are responsible for the health and well-being of the party and are equipped with spells and tools to help heal up party members as well as prevent damage. When anyone takes unnecessary damage or dies, healers need to be ready and prepared to help patch up the little mistakes made by the party. And when the party is healthy, they can output some reasonable damage themselves. Now I personally consider healers to be the most difficult role to fill, as they need to be a lot more perceptive than the rest of the party, to be able to keep an eye on things and to be prepared for when unexpected things happen so that they can be there to swiftly and flexibly patch up things that go wrong. That being said, there are more healers than tanks, and they are less in demand than tanks, but you are still finding that for the most part your queue times will still be much better than DPS, but not as good as tanks. Next are DPS, who are well equipped in their own ways to deal damage and bolster the damage of the rest of the party. Like I said before, DPS can be further broken down into three subcategories, so let's take a look at those individually. First is melee DPS. These DPS require to be in close proximity to their targets to deal their ideal damage, and they also have to consider positional mechanics. Certain attacks for these DPS will require them to either be on the flank or the rear of their enemy in order to be the most effective. Any mechanics that force melee DPS to move out of range, or any fights that require frequent turning, can greatly impact their DPS. Caster DPS cast spells, as their name suggests. While they don't have to worry for the most part about staying within range or at all with dealing with positionals, they instead have to take into account their cast times. Movement intensive mechanics can impact these DPS the most. And finally, we have ranged DPS. Unlike melee and casters, ranged DPS are, for the most part, completely unrestrained by mechanics such as range, positionals, or cast times. While the maximum damage output may not reach the same peaks as some melee and caster DPS, they are extremely flexible with dealing with any movement intensive mechanics and bring extremely valuable party utilities. Okay, with those little overviews out of the way, I think it's time we dive into each job individually, and we'll start off with the tanks again. First up is Paladin. Of the three tanks, Paladin is the stalwart defender, boasting incredibly strong defensive cooldowns and party utility. It is the only job in the game to employ the use of a shield, and is therefore the only job capable of blocking. You passively have a chance to block incoming attacks, but you also have cooldowns to increase your block rate or just outright guaranteed a successful block, which is extremely powerful considering that Stormblood now allows the blocking of magic attacks as well as physical. Paladin also has the strongest defensive cooldown in the game with Hollowed Ground, making them invulnerable to most attacks for 10 seconds. The biggest downside of this cooldown being that it has a lengthy cooldown of 7 minutes. Paladin also seems to have the lowest DPS potential after the tweaking made post Stormblood launch to balance out the 3 tanks, and due to this, Paladins can find themselves finding it much more difficult to hold enmity when they are trying to focus on outputting DPS. It's nothing a couple Shirks or Shadewalkers can't help fix though, and I really should not discourage you from playing this, as I personally consider it to be the most reliable tank of the 3. And next up is the Warrior, the rampaging berserker capable of extremely high DPS output when played well. This high DPS also has the benefit of helping them maintain extremely steady enmity even without having to use any of their enmity generating tools. One thing to note about Warrior's DPS though is just how much of it is tied to the optimal use of their inner release ability. A sizable chunk of their overall DPS is generated in this small 10-second window, and while it is an extremely powerful and satisfying burst of damage, even missing a single GCD in this window can greatly impact the Warrior's DPS. This is of course dependent on the person, but personally I consider this to be somewhat of a flaw in the job's design, but of course no one's really going to complain that much after landing 5 direct crit fell cleaves every 90 seconds. Another huge strength of the Warrior is their ability to seamlessly switch between their tank and DPS stances in between global cooldowns, something that Paladins need to use a global cooldown to do when switching between either stance, and that Dark Knights need to use a global cooldown to do when entering their tank stance. And while we've been focused a lot on Warrior's DPS, their defensive capabilities are pretty decent as well. Their version of the "I don't care, I'm going to eat all this damage and live" cooldown is Holmgang. Similarly to Hollowed Ground, this will ensure that most attacks will not reduce their HP below 1. This only lasts 6 seconds and will also bind the Warrior in place, but unlike Hollowed Ground, it only has a 3-minute cooldown and can be used much more frequently, which can make it shine in a much brighter light in certain scenarios. The Warrior is also well equipped with other decent cooldowns and self-heals, which, while not being as strong as Paladins, can be used more frequently due to having shorter cooldowns. Now, one final thing to note about Warriors is that I personally consider Warrior's tank stance of Defiance to not be as good as the other 2 tanks. Whereas Paladin and Dark Knight will immediately gain a 20% reduction in damage by activating their tank stance, Warriors will instead gain a higher maximum HP and can receive more healing from spells, but not from abilities. I personally consider the 20% reduction in damage to be far more beneficial, but nonetheless, Warrior is undoubtedly well equipped to deal with damage when in capable hands, and can boast an extremely high DPS output that is maybe even a little too high. But if you played Warrior back in Heavensward, that is not new news at all. And the last of the 3 tanks is Dark Knight. We had a Defender, we had a Berserker, and now we have an Edgelord, I guess. Whereas Paladin has the strongest cooldowns, Warrior has the highest DPS, Dark Knight is sort of in the middle ground. It's even been receiving changes and buffs even as recently as patch 4.3 to help it stand better among the other 2 tanks. Now let's talk about the things that Dark Knight does well. For starters, it hands down has the best defensive cooldown for dealing with magic damage in the form of Dark Mind. Its sort of DPS stance, Dark Side, can be active at the same time as their tank stance. Following that train of thought, Dark Side will also halt MP regeneration and will allow the use of Dark Arts, Dark Knight's signature move that you will not likely to forget because you will be pressing it a ton, and it will bolster a good portion of your skills and abilities and will increase your damage and effectiveness. Dark Arts uses MP, and therefore you'll actually have to be watching and managing your MP with the tools given to you to squeeze out even more Dark Arts uses. This can be more engaging for those who may find the other 2 tanks too mechanically simple, as other than Dark Arts you'll have several other off GCD abilities to press and sometimes double weave in between GCDs. This does get a little bit awkward at times, as one of Dark Knight's key DPS and MP regenerating tools is Blood Weapon, which will increase your attack speed and will also help you generate a surplus of MP to use even more Dark Arts. So sometimes you'll be double weaving in between GCDs that are made faster due to Blood Weapon, which makes this sort of an odd clash of job design, which always makes me raise an eyebrow and scratch my head whenever I play Dark Knight. I also think that Dark Knight has the worst "I don't care, I'm going to eat all this damage" cooldown of the 3. Living Dead will give you a safety net for 10 seconds, which if you do dip below 1 HP will prevent you from dying for 10 seconds. If you receive enough healing before these 10 seconds are up to equal your maximum HP, you'll continue to live. As a person who plays healers a lot, this is easily the most annoying defensive cooldown to deal with, especially in comparison to Hollow Ground and Home Game. Now, while I don't agree with all of the design choices of Dark Knight, I don't think it's a weak job. I do have a lot of criticisms of Dark Knight, but I think it is perfectly fine as is, and you should not shy away from playing this job if you want to. Okay, we spent a lot of time on the tanks, and now let's move on to the healers. White Mage is the iconic and traditional healer in the Final Fantasy series, and it is the strongest healer currently in the game. It boasts a wide selection of heals and abilities to bolster their effectiveness at filling up lost HP bars. However, it does lack party utility, and with the exception of Divine Benison, has no way of preventing incoming damage. White Mage at its core is extremely simple and straightforward, and for people looking to start healing, it is a great place to start. In fact, it is the only place to start, as Scholar and Astrologian both unlock and start at level 30, whereas you can play as Conjurer at level 1, which will later turn into White Mage at level 30. I stand by my statement by saying that they are indeed the strongest healers, but there is more to the healer role than just healing. They lack the ability to really branch out and help the party in other ways like the other two healers can. It's for this reason that White Mage at its strongest when paired with one of the other two healers. I have no trouble recommending this job or admitting that I have a lot of fun playing White Mage though, because it is a ton of fun. The Scholar employs the aid of a Faerie to help them in battle. They can choose between a healing-oriented or a support-oriented Faerie, and while they offer a little bit of difference between the two, they both have a basic heal to help with healing. Scholars themselves have a basic heal of their own, but they especially excel at damage mitigation. Scholar's strong single target heal and their only AoE healing spell have lower potencies than similar spells on the other two healers, but instead add shields which can absorb some damage. However, if filling HP bars isn't necessary, they do have access to an ability that will take the shield portion of those spells and make them restore HP instead, with the use of emergency tactics, which does have a short cooldown. Besides that, Scholar has extremely powerful healing abilities which do have reasonably short cooldowns, but also require the use of Aetherflow stacks, which you can replenish every 45 to 60 seconds. Having to manage your Faerie as well as ration out how and where you use your Aetherflow stacks adds a lot of complexity to Scholar that White Mage does not have, but if played well can greatly mitigate a lot of incoming damage to the party, and they do have enough tools to aid and bolster the healing partner where they may find themselves short when it comes to healing up large amounts of damage. The Astrologian is extremely interesting as it is designed to be flexible and has two different stances. These stances actually only affect 3 things and can only be changed outside of battle. Diurnal Stance will add a regen effect to one of their single target and one of their AoE healing spells, as well as give the Astrologian a passive 10% healing buff, whereas Nocturnal Stance will give those same spells a shield component instead and will give a slightly bigger 15% healing buff. This allows the Astrologian to pair well with either Scholar or White Mage, and to some extent another Astrologian. But the big draw of this job, pun totally intended, is their cards. They have access to 6 different cards they can draw every 30 seconds, which can be used to either increase DPS, reduce incoming damage, or restore MP and TP depending on the card that they draw. Astrologian possesses basic healing spells as well as flexible healing spells to employ regens or shields, but a good portion of their abilities is dedicated to interacting with their cards. As an Astrologian, when you draw a card, you can simply use it immediately, or you can store it away for later, channel it into a special effect that will work on the next card you use, maybe turn it into a potent healing or DPS ability. There is a lot of manipulation with your cards. You can also extend the duration of cards and buffs with abilities like Time Dilation and Celestial Opposition. If White Mage is a bit too simple for you and Scholar just isn't your style, Astrologian is a great choice for keeping you engaged and being a valuable healer with great and flexible party support. Alright, tanks and healers are out of the way, now we can talk about DPS, starting off with the melee. The Dragoon is a relatively simple and straightforward job, at least I like to think so, but the amount of Dragoons I see spamming nothing but their full thrust combo might say otherwise. If you can read your tooltips and put in a little bit of effort, I'd say that Dragoon is actually a great job to pick for beginners. The Dragoon unlocks abilities in a very intuitive manner, and it slowly grows on a simple foundation to a strong rotation at level 70. Once you understand the mechanics and know how to position yourself for the handful of positionals that Dragoon does have, the rest of the Dragoon's complexity comes from timing the activation of your Life of the Dragon buff, which again, with a little bit of effort, isn't too difficult to piece together yourself. A big strength of the Dragoon is that it is the only job of applying a piercing debuff to enemies, which will increase the Dragoon's DPS as well as range DPS. It also brings a party-wide crit buff, which, with crit being a huge stat for the majority of the jobs currently in patch 4.3, Dragoons are made extremely valuable in any party. Dragoon is a very simple and straightforward job with decent party utility. Just don't time your jumps badly and you'll be fine, and also make sure to use more than just your full thrust combo, please and thank you. Moving on to the Monk. Monk doesn't actually follow a normal combo rotation, and instead has 3 different stances, and being in a certain stance will allow them to execute a skill in a following stance, mimicking a combo-like system. As a Monk, you'll be keeping an eye on several different timers, and this flexibility allows you to choose which skill to use in order to upkeep all of your different buffs and debuffs. Unlike Dragoon, Monk is extremely dependent on positionals, as just about every single GCD that Monk has either a rear or flank positional. This makes it especially tough on Monks when dealing with bosses that constantly turn, or when mechanics force them to stack on one side of the boss, especially the front. It also makes soloing a lot of open world content really annoying, as you'll be facing the front of the enemy the majority of the time. Another weakness of Monk is how they need to build up their power and maintain it through combat due to Greased Lightning. This stacks up to 3 times and will increase their damage and attack speed, and any long breaks in a fight can force Monks to lose all of their stacks and have them build it back up again. Thankfully, they do have tools to help them with this process, such as Riddle of Earth, Perfect Balance, and Riddle of Wind, even Forn Shift. All of these will help them either maintain Greased Lightning or help them build it back up fast so that they can get back up to that peak power that they are known for. When allowed to properly get off all of their attacks in the right positions and to just stay in combat, Monks can be pretty big powerhouses. On top of that, they possess some pretty neat party utility. First up being Mantra, which will increase the healing received of all nearby party members by a pretty decent chunk. This is extremely helpful in phases of fights that output a lot of damage to the party. They can also increase the physical damage of all nearby party members by 5% every 90 seconds with Brotherhood. Something else to mention is that Brotherhood will also help them generate procs from Monk, something that they will normally have to do by critting their abilities on their own. One other thing of note is that at level 66, Monks will receive Riddle of Fire, which will slow down their GCDs in exchange for a huge buff and damage. This does slow down the flow of the job every 90 seconds, but also allows you to more comfortably double weave any abilities that you may have to use, which again makes me scratch my head even more when thinking about how Blood Weapon affects Dark Knight, although let's just keep that off. That's just a tangent we don't need to go to right now. All in all, Monk isn't too overly complex once you memorize which abilities need to be executed from where. The most difficult part of Monk, I'll say, is the upkeep of Greased Lightning, as some fights it is extremely difficult to maintain Greased Lightning, and having to build it back up again and constantly losing it can really affect the Monk's DPS. Other than that, Monks are extremely big powerhouses when it comes to damage, and they can increase other people's damage with the use of Brotherhood as well. The Ninja, very similarly to the Dragoon, has a very simple foundation which will be built upon as you level up. It also only has a handful of positionals. However, the Ninja does have a few more things that will make it a bit more difficult to fully grasp a job if you're picking it up and learning it for the first time. The most obvious of these being your mudra and memorizing the different ninjutsu outcomes based on how you input your 3 different mudra abilities. My best advice for you is to keep your mudra consistent in the same spots on your hotbars and to learn your ninjutsu by muscle memory. Once you are comfortable with all the different mudra combinations, as well as your 3 different combos that you have on Ninja, the rest of Ninja isn't actually that complex. One thing a lot of new ninjas struggle with is using and maintaining Huton, as it is by far your strongest ninjutsu, even though it very simply just increases your attack speed. You do have a gauge that will slowly fill up with auto attacks that you can expend on 3 different abilities, but this does feel a little bit tacked on, but nonetheless it's nice having more abilities to press on Ninja. Probably the biggest thing about Ninja once you've trained yourself to maintain Huton is to line up your abilities into your trick attack window. Trick Attack is a positional ability that will make the enemy more vulnerable to all attacks for 10 seconds. This is an extremely valuable tool for increasing your DPS as well as your entire party's DPS. Since it is able to be used once a minute, it will be lining up with at least somebody's burst window in your party. Other than Trick Attack, you also have your own enmity manipulation tools, including one that reduces the enmity of a party member that they will generate, and one to transfer your own enmity to someone else. Using these tools can help your tanks maintain a comfortable lead on enemy so that they can focus on DPS. Trick Attack and those enmity tools make ninjas very valuable assets to any party. And the last melee DPS to talk about is the Samurai, one of the new jobs added with Stormblood. Unlike the other 3 melee DPS, Samurai possesses very little in party utility that isn't taken from the role actions, and has no way of increasing the party's DPS like the other 3 melee DPS can. In exchange, Samurai instead deals considerably more personal DPS at their peak level, in theory anyway. Samurai has fallen on some hard times after the launch of Stormblood. While they were in a respectable spot at the launch of Stormblood, further job tweaking and balancing to other jobs while Samurai remained untouched meant that Samurai quickly fell behind. Samurai did indeed receive a few minor buffs in the most recent patch 4.3, but many people will agree that it isn't quite enough to really balance it against all the utility the other melee DPS can bring, which is a real shame because Samurai is one of the best designed jobs to be released in terms of job mechanics. Playing Samurai consists of moving between 3 different combos which will give you a damage buff, an attack speed buff, and also a slashing down debuff. Completing each combo will also get you a different sen depending on the combo executed, and you'll get access to different Iijatsu skills depending on how many sen you currently have built up. You will also be passively gaining Kenki to expend on powerful abilities by landing attacks and your positionals. Probably because Samurai was designed for Stormblood, its job gauge is well implemented. It doesn't feel tacked on like it does with certain other jobs. Everything about Samurai just flows extremely well, and it feels immensely satisfying to play once you've gotten all of your tools at level 70. I will say that of the 4 melee DPS, it is probably the most difficult to play well, since there are a lot of ways to misuse your Kenki gauge as well as misuse the sen you have built up. But a lot of that can just be because we've had the other melee DPS for much longer, whereas we've only had Samurai for about a year now. Also, despite Samurai only having 2 positionals to account for, it can be extremely devastating to miss a positional, especially if you are currently tight on Kenki. The Samurai might be lagging behind in the community's eye, but seeing how well designed Samurai is and how much fun I personally have playing it, I still recommend giving it a shot if it catches your eye, as I have had way too much fun playing it to not recommend it to others. And we can just only hope that it will be rebalanced soon against the other melee DPS. Okay, let's move over to the casters now, starting with the iconic Black Mage. Black Mage is a traditional caster through and through. As a Black Mage, you'll want to find every opportunity to just plant your feet and start casting your extremely potent spells. You'll find that as a Black Mage, your actual rotation is extremely simple, and mostly consists of a little bit of build up followed by as many Fire 4s as you can possibly fit before you need to refresh Astral Fire, and then a whole lot more Fire 4s until you run out of MP, and then back to building yourself up again so you can spam more Fire 4. There's a little more detail in it, but not a whole lot, because the difficulty of playing Black Mage is not in the rotation, but in finding the ability to get your cast off while also doing mechanics. Black Mages want very much to stand still and cast, but many mechanics will require movement, and this is where Black Mages are taken out of their comfort zone. You thankfully do have several tools to help with movement. Several spells can proc instant cast spells, which can be helpful when you need to move. You also have access to abilities to make your normal spells instant cast as well, and you can even teleport to party members. And the reward for minimizing your movement is a whole ton of DPS. Black Mages have incredibly great single target DPS and pretty high AoE damage capability as well, and some crowd control, but to be honest, you'll almost never use that. Also, due to how Umbral Ice replenishes your MP, you'll never be resource starved as a Black Mage. If you struggle with rotations, Black Mage has a very simple one, but finding every opportunity to minimize movement is a challenge in itself, so you're still going to have to work hard to get that high DPS. Summoner is often cited as one of the most complex and difficult jobs to learn and play properly, and while I agree it can be a bit difficult and daunting, I don't think it's actually as difficult as you may think it to be. Summoners employ an Eggy to help them in battle. You can choose between a tank, caster, or melee pet, although most seem to agree that Ifrit Eggy is the strongest, and Garuda Eggy is occasionally useful, with Titan Eggy almost never getting used. Similarly to Black Mage, Summoner's basic rotation is actually very simple, applying 2 different dots every 30 seconds and using 1 of 2 ruin spells as filler depending on if you need to move or need to weave something in between your global cooldowns. You also do have to manage your pet a little, but aside from positioning it and occasionally pressing an ability, it's nothing too intensive. Where a lot of people start to feel overwhelmed is the massive amount of cooldowns and abilities that you will need to press, both on your end as well as your pets. Once you achieve the button mash and opener, and the job's rotation starts to even out into something a little bit more simpler, it really just becomes a matter of being aware of certain timers to ensure that some things do overlap and that other things do not. I'm not going to lie, it's going to take a lot of practice to play this job properly, but if you are dedicated and do a lot of practice, you'll have access to one of the most well-rounded jobs in the game. Capable of great single target damage, summoners are also the kings of AoE damage. Not only that, but they are not as hindered by movement as Black Mage is, and provide some party utility in abilities such as Devotion and Radiant Shield, which can add some small but noticeable increases to party DPS nonetheless. Another huge utility of Summoner is the ability to raise dead party members, something that only the Red Mage and the healers can do otherwise. All in all, Summoner used to be something that I barely touched in Heavensward, but it is now one of my favorite jobs to play in Stormblood. And the final caster to talk about is the Red Mage, the second job added in Stormblood. Similar to my thoughts about Samurai, probably because this job was specifically designed for Stormblood, it is one of the best designed jobs currently in the game. You'll be using the Red Mage's dual cast ability a lot. This makes it so that for every spell you cast, your next one will be insta-cast, essentially making every other spell you cast instant, freeing up lots of opportunities for movement or for pressing abilities off the global cooldown. You'll use your shorter casting spells to instantly cast your harder hitting spells that have longer cast times, all while balancing between white and black mana on your job gauge. It's all extremely intuitive. So intuitive, in fact, that I confidently declare that Red Mage is the easiest job to pick up and master in the game currently. Your goal as a Red Mage is to build up your black and white mana while making sure that neither side overtakes the other. And once you've built up enough, you can use your melee combo to unlock a big spell and unleash a big burst of damage. It flows surprisingly well, and your gauge similarly fills up surprisingly smoothly. Like I mentioned before, Red Mages have the ability to raise dead party members, and their dual cast ability makes it extremely painless to do so, other than the obvious loss in DPS and MP. Aside from that, Red Mage has access to Vercure, which is a very respectable heal, and the only one in the hands of a DPS that can reliably sustain someone in the place of a healer. It also has access to a party-wide buff that increases physical DPS for the party, and the Red Mage's personal DPS that gradually drops off over 20 seconds. Red Mage is just a well-designed job. It has some pretty great utilities, which will help in some sticky situations, and have some ways of increasing the party's DPS. Its personal DPS peaks a little bit lower than other DPS, however, although with how intuitive the job is, the average player does seem to do very well on Red Mage. It is extremely popular, and if you have Stormblood installed, it is a very easy job to pick up and learn. Alright, just 2 more jobs left, and those are the ranged DPS. So, let's talk about Bard. If there's one thing I can say about Bard is that so far, in its 3 iterations, it has changed drastically each time. If you only played Bard in A Realm Reborn or in Heavensward, you'll return to it in Stormblood to find that it is very different, and in my opinion it is the most true to the Bard identity as it ever has been so far. With MP and TP restoration being moved to the role action list as abilities for ranged DPS to tank, Bard was free to change how their songs worked, and it was for the better. Now, Bard will sing one of their 3 songs, Mage's Ballad, Army's Paean, and Wanderer's Minuet to give the party a flat 2% crit buff. Since each song lasts 30 seconds and has a cooldown of 80 seconds, it means that you can always be singing at least one of them, meaning that this party buff is constant. And Bard is still filled with party utility still. With Troubadour, depending on the song they are currently singing, they'll be able to cast a party-wide buff including a 10% reduction to magic damage, 10% reduction to physical damage, or an increase to maximum HP by 15% for 30 seconds. They also have access to Battle Voice, which places a direct hit buff on the party, excluding the Bard unfortunately. They can sing Foe Requiem, which drains their MP but increases the damage taken by all nearby party members by 3%. They also have access to the Warden's Pain, which acts similar to Asuna but is instant cast and also pre-castable, and also to Nature's Mine, which acts as a Pocket Convalescence, which increases the healing received of the person you cast it on with a very short cooldown. On top of that, bards can take the role action abilities we mentioned before, Refresh and Tactician, which will have their enmity and place a party-wide buff which will replenish MP and TP respectively. And also they can take Palisade, which acts like a pocket rampart that you can cast on a party member, but this time it does have a lengthy cooldown of 3 minutes. But the takeaway of this is that Bard is just chock filled with party utilities, and they are extremely valuable on that alone. Now, bards on their own have a relatively low peak in their own personal DPS, but their massive amounts of party utility make them very much in demand anyway. But let's just talk about bard on its own. One thing that you may find irritating about bard is just how reliant it is on procs to deal its damage. All of their songs provide bard with a different mechanic that utilizes crit procs from their 2 dots. Minuet will build up stacks to expend on a powerful ability similar to Monk. Ballad is similar to the old bard trait Rivers of Death, which will reset Bloodletter and Rain of Death's recast time on a proc, and Paeon will give the bard a stacking attack speed buff that caps at 4 stacks. On top of that, bard's hardest hitting skill, Refulgent Arrow, requires a straighter shot proc to use, and those only have a 20% chance to proc from using a heavy shot, so it's very possible that you may not get one in your Raging Strikes window to use with Barrage. Bard is extremely proc centric, and for some people who like consistency, that may not be for them. But if that doesn't bother you, then I highly recommend Bard. It just feels like Bard, and it has such a wide variety of party utility that makes it so very valuable for any party. And finally, we have the Machinist. They wield guns and can summon turrets to deal auto attacks, but they don't have nearly as many interactions as you would expect from, say, a summoner and their Eggies. One of them is in fact able to explode your turret and front load its damage while making it unsummonable for a while. Another is to hypercharge your turret, which increases its damage output and will reduce the enemy's physical or magical vulnerability depending on which turret you have summoned. And beyond that, they have access to Refresh, Tactician, and Palisade, just like Bard. Not nearly as many utility options as Bard, but they do possess a higher personal DPS in comparison if played well. Which leads us into the fact that other than Summoner, many consider Machinist to be one of the most difficult and complex jobs in the game. And I agree, Machinist can be very tough to play. Now at its base core, you do have a combo to go through that uses a proc system. Each part of the combo has a 50% chance to proc the next. Thankfully, you have access to ammo which will force procs as well as slightly increase skill potency. But whenever you don't have ammo, you can imagine how irritating and frustrating it is when the RNG just doesn't seem to agree with you. Once you understand the proc combo system Machinist has and how ammo can be used to manipulate it, you have a variety of cooldowns and abilities to use. And the famous Wildfire. This places a time bomb on the enemy which explodes after 10 seconds and will deal damage equal to 25% of the damage you deal in that window. Which is basically just a gimmicky way of dealing 25% more damage for 10 seconds, except extremely more restrictive and stressful to optimize. The last major mechanic of Machinist is the heat and overheating mechanic. When you have the Gauss Barrel on, you'll deal 5% more damage and can build up heat. When your heat is above 50, your basic combo will gain new and ridiculous animations and also deal more damage. And once you reach 100 heat, you'll begin to overheat for 10 seconds, which will increase your damage dealt by 20%. And once the overheat phase ends, Gauss Barrel will be removed and you'll be unable to place it back on for 10 seconds. And now you can sort of piece together what your main goal is. As a Machinist, you need to time your overheat window with your Wildfire window and to cram as many cooldowns and abilities into that 10-second window to make a huge burst of damage. Unfortunately, this leads you to losing Gauss Barrel and your new silly animations every 10 seconds. This basically means that for 1/6 of the fight you are without Gauss Barrel and without your heat gauge. Now, let's talk about overheat. Like with Summoner, once you get to practicing and can press things in the correct order, fitting your abilities into your overheat and Wildfire window actually isn't too bad in the ideal scenario. You'll find that when you're hitting a dummy, it is actually not that bad. However, you'll notice something about your cooldowns and abilities. Aside from the things that interact with your turret, all of your abilities and cooldowns have extremely short cooldowns that are either a minute or less. You'll find that because of this, any breaks in a fight can greatly trip you up, as you find a lot of your abilities are now misaligned. Machinist can easily become a mess as you try your best to fix things and line them back up. It has a very high learning curve and requires you to think on your feet and try and fix things and make them all fit back together when fights just try to tear them apart. And compared to Bard, it brings a little less more utility, but again, if you can really hammer in this job and you're just really good at timing things, it does have more personal DPS than Bard. If this job sounds cool to you, then give it a shot, pun intended. Just know that it's going to be a very tough road attempting to wrap your head around this job. And that's it. All 15 jobs. We got through it in the end. Again, these are just my takes on each of the jobs, and these little snippets of descriptions and advice are really no substitute for actual experience. If something looks interesting, go unlock it and give it a try. You can level everything on a single character, so just go give it a try. And that's all I got, really. That's it. If you have any other questions, feel free to comment it down below. I post plenty of Final Fantasy content on my channel if you're looking for more. Occasional guides like this one. I have a let's play of a new character that I've been having a ton of fun updating. And beyond that, I just post myself having fun on my usual characters. So if that sounds enjoyable or entertaining, feel free to subscribe and check out some more stuff and support me. That'd be great. But yeah. That's all I got. Feel free to leave any questions and feedback like I said before, and I guess I'll see you guys in another video hopefully. Until then, sayonara, bye bye.